We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
This is a far, far more serious crisis.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
There's a lot to do, and we have a world to win. Welcome back to World to Win with this week's exciting episode on global struggles. Last week, we talked about Trotsky's legacy in a two-part series. So if you missed it, be sure to check it out after today's show, of course. I want to welcome back my co-host, Yara, who took a week off last week. Yara, we missed you, but what an exciting episode to come back to.
I know, I'm so excited. Thank you so much. It's great to be back and really can't wait to hear from everyone today.
Great. So I want to encourage everyone to share the stream that they're watching to get everybody in touch with what it is that we're talking about today. We're going to talk about struggles happening on all different continents, and so it should be a really good show. We're going to focus on massive revolts taking place specifically in Bolivia, Belarus, and Lebanon. And we've invited three speakers to give us the latest updates and analysis, a socialist analysis, of course, on what's happening in these countries. So we'll be talking to JJ, who's a member of the International Socialist Alternatives Executive. How's it going? And he follows closely also on the events happening in North Africa, the Middle East as well. So be sure to come in with some questions and let's pick his brain today. We have Andre, who's a member of the International Socialist Alternative in Brazil. And he follows closely with what's going on in Latin America. And we will also hear from Socialist Alternative in Russia to talk about what's happening in Belarus. So let's get started. And, first I just want to begin talking a little bit about, globally what's happening. Right now, we're still in a pandemic, right? It's not over, but the shock of the virus itself definitely has passed. People are becoming accustomed to the whole mask thing. People are out of work. Many people have, lost their jobs, struggling with rent, but it's not new anymore. But we can't say the same for mass struggle. That didn't die down. There's no, there hasn't been a pause in that really. So Andre, can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing with all the mass struggle that's happening currently?
Yes. Well, Toya, I believe that we are living the first steps of should turn into a great wave of struggles on international scale. The examples of Lebanon, Belarus, and Bolivia make this clear, but we also see the pressure cooker boiling in several other Latin American countries and other regions of the world. We have seen demonstrations in Thailand, in Iraq, and we have seen a coup d'etat in Mali after big demonstrations taking place. So this happens in the context of the most serious crisis of capitalism since the 1930s. And the effects on the consciousness of millions of the impact of the pandemic and the barbarity it has generated in many countries, particularly on the poorest and most oppressed sectors of the populations, will have a strong impact. And this also takes place in the context of political and social polarization in many countries, which includes the actions of extreme right-wing forces and movements of reactionary character in various parts of the world, coup d'etats and authoritarian escalation. So we have seen elements of revolution and counter-revolutions present in various regions. So the capitalist system is less and less able to live with basic democratic rights and tends towards authoritarian way out. So at the same time, mass resistance has been rising to oppose it. So the great contradiction is still the absence of a clear anti-capitalist and socialist alternative for the masses and the crisis of the leadership of these struggles. But the struggles to come will open up opportunities for the process of consciousness to move forward and forge new political alternatives and new leadership also, it's what I think.
I'm very excited to hear about these opportunities that we have and what it's going to take for us to move forward. But before we get there, JJ, what's your take on the situation right now?
Well, the thing, if you look at the situation in Lebanon, for example, like pretty much everywhere else in the world, the early stages of the league provoked, a kind of stunning effect on the struggles. Now, to go back a little bit in time, it's good to remember that at the peak of the movement in October in Lebanon last year, there were close to 2 million people on the streets in a country of 6 million inhabitants. And it's not only the numerical, but also the geographical scope of the movement that was unprecedented, as every part of the country was rocked by protest, including cities that had been long considered as a sectarian stronghold. And this revolutionary uprising, because that's what it was, overthrew the then government led by the Sunni billionaire Saad Hariri, and subsequent mass mobilization blocked 2 other prime minister replacements after that. But in January, a new supposedly technocratic government was put together. And then quickly after that, the outbreak of the pandemic put the mass movement on hold. Public gatherings were banned. And although there were still some small and sporadic protests here and there, essentially that brought the first phase of the movement to an end. However, what the COVID-19 crisis also did, and that's similar in many other places of the world, is that it exposed and exacerbated all the problems against which the Lebanese people had revolted in the first place. So the lockdown measures, for example, since the government hadn't put no social safety net in place, dramatically increased the economic burden on the shoulders of the most vulnerable. And that's the period where we saw many individual acts of desperation making the headlines, self-immolations, a taxi driver setting his car on fire, people selling their kidneys to be able to pay their rents and things like that. But after the initial phase of shock provoked by COVID and by the sudden acceleration of the economic crisis, the Lebanese masses were actually among the first internationally to come back on the street. So from April onwards, more significant demonstrations started to re-emerge, braving the curfew to challenge the new government. And interestingly, one of the slogans and hashtags used on social media was, "We are coming back." And even though this comeback did not get anywhere near the numbers that had been on the streets last year, these protesters had clearly large support in the broader society. And then, of course, early this month, you had this devastating explosion in Beirut, which almost immediately triggered a rebirth of the mass movement and toppled down the second government in less than a year's time.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point, and I want to hear from Andre as well about it. Do you think that the development of the struggle in 2019, like how big it was, do you think that COVID-19 stunned it, or do you think that it actually helped it?
Yeah, well, there is no doubt that the pandemic has profoundly affected the great mass movements that we saw in 2019. There has been a retreat from the struggles in most countries. A clear example of this, in the case of Latin America, is the situation in Chile, for example, where the mass uprising of October 2019 continued until the beginning of this year. In March, there were plans for big mobilizations related to the plebiscite on the constitutional process that was to take place on April 26th. So the big demonstrations that happened on 8th of March, the International Day of Women's Struggle, were a sign of the strength of the struggle that would take place. This was also the case in Brazil. The March 8th women's demonstration in Brazil should have been the first step of a whole journey of struggles against Bolsonaro that was to continue throughout March. But with the pandemic, these struggles did not happen as planned, and the movement retreat. Millions of workers and poor people, Black, indigenous, etc., the sectors more vulnerable to the pandemic, were facing serious risk to their lives. Today, we have more than 7 million cases of COVID-19 in Latin America and more than 270,000 deaths in the region. So in the region, Brazil and Mexico have the most serious situation, but we have a terrible situation in Peru, for example, that is the country with the highest mortality rate of the pandemic at this moment in the world. So, but despite it having affected the struggles at first, the pandemic only deepened and made even more unbearable the evils that provoked the 2019 mobilizations, such as inequality, the poverty, attacks on workers' rights, police violence, distrust of the political system, etc. So all these things are even worse at this moment. So obviously, the movement we had in the US is an example of how the mass struggle has resurfaced in the face of racist police violence, even in the middle of the pandemic. In Latin America, millions of workers have lost their income, and the emergency measures taken by certain governments have been insufficient in many cases. So this is clearly the case in Bolivia. In this country, 9 out of 10 people saw their income reduced during the pandemic, with 4 out of 10 simply no longer having any income. So this meant that after some time with few mobilizations, the struggle began to overflow in the peripheries and poor areas of the big cities, in the countryside among the indigenous communities, but also among various sectors of the working class. What we are seeing now is a dynamic of resuming the thread of the continuity of the struggles of 2019. But this is likely to be further radicalized by the terrible experience of massive debt, hunger, and the inability of governments to deal with the social and health crisis.
Thanks so much. I just want to remind our viewers to make sure you like and subscribe to our channel, but also we can ask our panelists questions about the specifics about what they're saying, their take on different events that are happening around the world. So make sure you're active in the comment section. Before we move on to our special feature talking about Belarus, I want to ask one more question to JJ. Even like the capitalist media and the mainstream media. Right now, they're speaking about how the pandemic showed that the system we live in needs change. And at the same time, we're seeing inequality levels that are surging through this time. They're higher, they're going through the roof. Is this going to have an effect on how the capitalists deal with the situation? Are they going to legislate and make changes, based on these inequalities? What's your take on that? What's it going to take to make change?
Well, I think in a sense, when you look at the situation in Lebanon, you have a typical graphical example of how the system has been working to basically steal and organize a large-scale holdup of the country's resources by a small group of political and financial gangsters. And I think the reaction that we are seeing today in Lebanon is also a typical example of the kind of reaction that we're going to see in other parts of the world as well. But if you look in Lebanon, since the end of the civil war in 1990, there has been a massive transfer of money that has taken place from the pockets of ordinary working class Lebanese to the tiny corrupt oligarchy who control the economy and the state. And one important thing to know about Lebanon is that the political and the banking spheres have incestuous ties with each other. So many politicians are bankers themselves, and that was the case with the previous Prime Minister Hariri. That's also the case with a number of other ministers in the present government. And in fact, the Lebanese banks are owned predominantly by politicians. An estimated 40% of bank assets are owned by politicians. The change is not going to come from these people. Lebanese banks have made massive profits over the years, financed by what we would call a sort of gigantic Ponzi scheme, which the ruling parties and successive government, as well as the central banks, have all been complicit in supporting and benefiting from in various ways. And so, yeah, it's been a whole circus that has allowed the banks in Lebanon to accumulate a lot of profits in a totally parasitic manner, to the point that today, for example, the part of the public debt which is owed to the national banking sector represents about twice the country's income. And the building of this huge financial bubble started to unravel last year. And of course, as always, the working class and the poor are being asked to foot the bill through public spending cuts, new privatization, tax on the poor, like the WhatsApp tax that has triggered the uprising last year. Policies that for years already had increased poverty, unemployment, had cut essential services to the bone, while at the same time eroding economic growth and pushing the debt to spiral uncontrollably to the point of bringing the country on the verge of a complete economic collapse, and then to its first debt default in March of this year. So to sum it up, it's really the enrichment of a handful of financial parasites and the corrupt accomplices in the political establishment that has brought the country to its knees.
Thank you, JJ. I think this is really interesting and really important. I think also leads us well to the first mass protest we're going to talk about today, which is Belarus. And I think we've all heard about the significant protests now, and now that includes strikes as well in Belarus. And I think today there's been massive protests again, even though the military was on the street, and there was obviously big police presence as well, and rain on top of everything else. It's Lukashenko's birthday today, so people brought him presents, which is great. They brought him all the presents he needs, from the coffins, all the wreaths, all the placards with slogans that had "Happy Overthrow Day," "No presents today, you don't deserve them." You can blow out the candles in The Hague, so that's always great. And I think it's going to be really interesting to think about this in the context of COVID, but generally in the context of kind of like the new wave of mass movements now in the kind of like tail end, hopefully, of this pandemic. I want to hear a little bit from our comrades in Russia and Belarus. So let's hear from Mitya, who's going to be reading out a recorded report from Dennis, which is going to be in English, about the situation in the country and also what the working class needs to do and the steps forward.
Hello, comrades. My name is Mitya Paratikov. I'm from Moscow and fighting together with the Russian section of the International Socialist Alternative. What is happening in Belarus now is a political revolution against authoritarian rule in one of the post-Soviet Bonapartist regimes. Many say this is like the colored revolutions that we have seen across this region. But in Belarus, there is a major difference: the very active involvement of the working class using its own methods of struggle. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of pro-capitalist forces left most of the new countries under the control of authoritarian Bonapartes. Hello, comrades. Hello, comrades. My name is Mitya Paratikov. I'm from Moscow and fighting together with the Russian section of the International Socialist Alternative. What is happening in Belarus now is a political revolution against authoritarian rule in one of the post-Soviet Bonapartist regimes. Many say this is like the colored revolutions that we have seen across this region. But in Belarus, there is a major difference: the very active involvement of the working class using its own methods of struggle. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of pro-capitalist forces left most of the new countries under the control of authoritarian Bonapartes. Their aim was to conduct neoliberal reforms. Hello, comrades. My name is Mitya Paratikov. I'm from Moscow and fighting together with the Russian section of the International Socialist Alternative. What is happening in Belarus now is a political revolution against authoritarian rule in one of the post-Soviet Bonapartist regimes. Many say this is like the colored revolutions that we have seen across this region. But in Belarus, there is a major difference: the very active involvement of the working class using its own methods of struggle. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of pro-capitalist forces left most of the new countries under the control of authoritarian Bonapartes. Hello, comrades. My name is Mitya Paratikov. I'm from Moscow and fighting together with the Russian section of the International Socialist Alternative. Hello, comrades. My name is Mitya Paratikov. I'm from Moscow and fighting together with the Russian section of the International Socialist Alternative. What is happening in Belarus now is a political revolution against authoritarian rule in one of the post-Soviet Bonapartist regimes. Many say this is like the colored revolutions that we have seen across this region. But in Belarus, there is a major difference: the very active involvement of the working class using its own methods of struggle. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of pro-capitalist forces left most of the new countries under the control of authoritarian Bonapartes. Their aim was to conduct neoliberal reforms with the working class forces atomized, with the former Soviet bureaucrats, now the new capitalists, protected from popular protests. Mostly, neoliberal reforms were conducted using shock therapy, but in Belarus, they were introduced gradually, using the Chinese approach. Slow privatization, the gradual reduction of social benefits. During his first decade of rule, Lukashenko maintained some popularity from this. But if anyone thinks that slow reforms mean they are less cannibalistic, they are mistaken. In Belarus today, a horrific 60% of workers work in a private sector. But state enterprises also obey the laws of the market, with the state holding golden shares and sharing profits with the capitalists. Lukashenko has introduced the monstrous contract labor system, so workers can be fired without notice or compensation, and then are required to return all bonus payments for the year, and the bonuses make up 40% of wages. Such conditions exist nowhere else. In 26 years, Lukashenko has eliminated practically all opposition forces. He organized death squads to kidnap and execute political opponents, and long prison terms await members of illegal organizations. This is one of the most severe Bonapartist regimes in the former USSR. Belarus was one of the most industrialized centers in the Soviet Union, but since the economy has become dependent on cheap oil and gas from Russia, this gave it a competitive advantage to export cheap goods across the former USSR. Lukashenko posed as a supporter of union with Russia, hoping to maintain this situation, while Russian capital wanted to participate in Belarusian privatization. 10 years ago, the Russian Gazprom began to turn the screw on Belarus by raising energy costs to demand increased integration and access to privatization plans. Lukashenko, in his own words, said this made him no longer president, but warehouse manager, and Belarus just a region of Russia. This created huge economic problems, budget shortfalls, a decline in the national currency, especially when Lukashenko turned on the money printing presses. Lukashenko turned to the West, which dictated its conditions, promising credits only if European capital got free access to the Belarusian market. Instead, to cut budget deficits, he introduced a tax on the unemployed, causing a serious wave of opposition across the country, mainly from working class men and women. Then coronavirus arrived. Instead of fighting it, Lukashenko denied it was dangerous, just pouring oil onto the fires of the already huge dissatisfaction. The Belarusian elite around Lukashenko decided to act. The banker Babariko, the former minister Tsipkalo, and video blogger Tikhanovsky decided to stand in the presidential election. Tens of thousands of people joined in to collect nomination signatures, with queues of people spreading for many quarters. Bonaparte replied with police provocations, arresting the blogger Tikhanovsky, opening criminal charges against Babariko, and forcing Tsipkalo to flee to Russia. The masses came out in protest, shouting, "Let them go free." Opinion polls were banned after one showed Lukashenko's rating had fallen to 3%. People started to shout, "We are the 97%. Lukashenko thought he was safe until Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, wife of the arrested blogger, decided to stand. The sexist and patriarchal Lukashenko underestimated her, launching a campaign of slanders and insults against Tikhanovskaya. But she quickly gathered signatures, were registered to stand. 60,000 turned out to her first meeting, making it clear a huge clash with the Bonapartist regime was looming. On election night, Lukashenko brazenly claimed 80% of the vote. He unfolded a reign of terror, switching off the internet lasting 3 days at the Amman riot police created a zone of permanent conflict as they broke up peaceful protests and arrested more than 7,000. Many were tortured, some raped, and at least 3 killed. The working class could not remain on the side. At the Minsk tractor factory, when workers heard that 26 of their co-workers had been arrested, they declared a strike. A political strike spread from factory to factory. Some stopped work for an hour, the others for 2, some for a whole day. Strike committees formed at most larger factories. The threat of a general strike so scared Lukashenko, he immediately retreated. Terror was temporarily suspended. Mass demonstrations spread across the whole country. About 350,000 came out on the street in the first days after the elections. The Belarus political elite quickly organized the Coordination Council of the Opposition, which declared it wanted the peaceful transition of power to negotiate with Lukashenko and allow him to participate in new free elections. It is attempting to buy the loyalty of the strike committees by giving each of them tens of thousands of euros. The small independent unions linked to the European trade union bureaucracy are encouraging the strike committees to succumb to the Coordination Council. The European Union is openly supporting the Council too. Putin, after weeks of silence, is now forming an Amman riot police unit to send to Belarus to support Lukashenko. However, so far Russia has not intervened directly. In Russia itself, the majority are clearly not on Lukashenko's side, which puts huge pressure on Putin. So it is very difficult to predict how he will act if there is an escalation of the conflict. Actually, Lukashenko is not Putin's best choice. Babariko, linked to Russia's Gazprom, would be a better candidate now. Socialist Alternative in Russia fully supports the struggle of the Belarusian people and the working class against Lukashenko. An all-out general strike organized by the strike committees can bring down this dictatorial regime. Workers too need to be well organized to fight for an end to the unemployed tax, contract system, and privatization. We have no confidence in the Coordination Council that no one elected and just represent businesses and elite. Only a constituent assembly representing all sections of the working class should decide what form of state and economic system can resolve the problems and take Belarus out of crisis. Only in an independent, democratic, and socialist Belarus will, with the support of the working class of the whole region and world, can resolve this problem. Thank you.
Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I hope you enjoyed and learned a little bit about the situation going on in Belarus. So now we're going to move to Bolivia. And we have Andre here with us. So if you have questions about what's going on in Bolivia or Latin America in general, feel free to put them in the comments and Andre will answer them for you. But can you talk, start us off a little bit, Andre, about, what's going on, this mass resistance? We spoke a little bit last week about the legacy of, the Morales government, but right now we're seeing, mass resistance to dictators being ousted. We're seeing, questions about when they're going to be able to hold elections. Can you explain a little bit about your take on what's going on right now?
Yeah, Toya. I think that the first thing is to be clear on what is happening in relation to the actual government of Bolivia and what happened with Evo Morales' government. What happened in November 2019 was a coup d'etat. There can be no doubt about that. What we had were attacks by extreme right-wing paramilitary groups on workers' organizations and members of the government. It was an action coordinated with mutiny by the police and the army command demanding the resignation of Evo Morales. And the fact that Evo Morales did not resist the imposition of the armed forces and accepted the resignation does not give any legitimacy to Jeanine Áñez's new government. So an idea of what really happened in Bolivia in 2019 can be seen in the explicit pronouncement of Elon Musk, this billionaire owner of a Tesla company, when asked on Twitter if his interests in Bolivian lithium were behind the coup, he simply replied, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with." So it's clear what interests are behind this coup last year. So the coup was planned and organized action by most reactionary oligarchies in Bolivia in conjunction with the U.S. Department of State in coordinated actions also with the Organization of American States and the ultra-right government of Bolsonaro in Brazil and the military in Brazil, representing the Soviet imperialist interests of Brazilian landowners in Bolivia. But it's important to point out that from our point of view, the repudiation of the coup cannot be confused with support for all the policies of the MAS and Evo Morales government. There were elements of authoritarianism in the government of MAS, mainly against sectors of workers, peasants, and indigenous movement that disagreed with Evo Morales' conciliatory stance towards the right and the ruling class. Evo Morales had many conflicts with the indigenous movement, as in the case of the road over the indigenous territory of Tipinis, also with the workers' movement on the questions, for example, of the new pension law and other attacks against workers. So there is no doubt that the 2019 coup struck hard at the little democracy that was in the country and promoted a step backwards in every way. So what is happening now is a resistance process against the consequences of that coup d'etat. And it was force and the will to fight by the Bolivian masses against this new government.
I mean, this massive resistance we're seeing all over the world, but I think the tactics that they're using in Bolivia are interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the miners and how they're fighting back?
We need to understand that although Evo did not call for mass resistance to the coup in 2019, there was an intense mobilization of workers, peasants, and indigenous people. For several weeks, mobilizations took place in various parts of the country, repudiating the new government of Jeanine Áñez. But this movement did not have a consistent leadership because both the MAS and also the leadership of the COP, the Bolivian Workers' Central, and other organizations opted for negotiation and agreement around the calling of new elections, which were previously planned for May. So there was also intense repression at that time, as in the case of the massacres in Sacaba and Sencata, where at least 33 people were killed by the forces of repression. So the government of Áñez used the pandemic to postpone the date of the elections at last 3 times. So if the elections really happen in October 18, as we expect, we would have had a whole year of an absolutely illegitimate government in Bolivia. So in the face of these postponements, a mass movement exploded with the COP and the Pact of Unity, different social movements, calling for an indefinite strike with roadblocks. So the method of blockades used by different sectors of the movement is traditional in the Bolivian social movement, particularly the peasant movement and also some urban social movements. In other Latin American countries, it also happens, as in the case of the Argentinian piqueteros, for example. The piqueteers in Argentina is a movement formed mainly by unemployed workers. And more than 100 roadblocks have been organized in Bolivia for almost 2 weeks. So there have been demonstrations, but the strike properly in the big urban centers has been limited. So the idea of a really general strike is not really what happened. So preventing the circulation of goods is a valid way of doing the struggle to blockade the roads, but it cannot be limited to that. So the massive engagement of workers in the struggles is necessary, and this means great street demonstrations, but above all, the paralysis of production, strikes, a general strike for real, that is, involving millions of workers in conscious action. So it's just to understand what's happening now. After almost 2 weeks of mobilizations, Evo Morales and the mass leadership built an agreement in the Legislative Assembly that set the 18th October as the maximum date for elections. With some reluctance, the leadership of the COP and the Pact of Unity ended up accepting this agreement and suspending the mobilizations and the blockades. Some sectors of the movement, more critical to the leadership, did not accept immediately this suspension of the movement decided by the COP. And in the end, they were not able to continue, but they can go back to the struggle soon. So Evo Morales was against the mobilizations from the beginning. The center of his policy, and I think this is very important politically on the strategy put forward by the movement, the center of his policy is to achieve an electoral victory that will bring the mass back to power. So to do so, he accepts some pressure so that the elections actually take place, but he does not want to go all the way in the struggle to overthrow Agnes, for example. So Evo explicitly positioned himself against the demand for the fall of Agnes, a demand that grew in the mobilizations. So this policy is a big mistake and reflects the limits of the mass and Evo Morales' leadership, and we should take this into account. But the same mistake was made in Brazil, for example, by Lula and PT. So the thing is to continue the struggle, organizing the struggle, and the mobilization is the only way to go forward.
Thanks so much. It's so exciting what's happening there. And I love seeing, you know, the traditional way of fighting back this use of blockades and striking. You know, it seems that oftentimes the working class forgets and has, you know, short-term memory loss as to what it takes and what we're capable of when we have united action fighting back. And it's good to see, you know, the miners in Bolivia using this method. So before we go to our next question, I just wanted to, Andre, you wrote an article that I think is great to talk about what's going on in Bolivia right now, and it lays out our program and what's needed. And the article is on the International Socialist Alternative website. It's called Mass Struggle to Overthrow Áñez and Assure Free and Democratic Elections Now. So I know Yara had a question for you actually about those elections. Yara, take it away.
Yes, thank you. First of all, that article is amazing. You have to go and read it after the broadcast, of course. I think the question of elections is really generally interesting, I think, now, because we have all of these mass movements, but also a lot of really important and big elections around the world. And I was just wondering, first of all, what you thought that the 18th of October elections are going to bring, like what should we expect from them, and also how to connect that to the mass movement, and what's the role of the elections within.
Yeah, well, I think that the main point is that it's very difficult to accept that we will have in Bolivia free and democratic elections under a government based on a coup d'etat and the role that is playing the government of Jeanine Áñez. We need to have clear that the only way to get a really democratic elections if the workers' movement and the social movements in general are mobilized, are on the streets, are struggling for their demands. And I think that the Bolivian demonstrators were correct in placing the need to overthrow the Agnes government. It's a condition to have a really democratic election process. With this government, there will be no free and democratic elections anyway. So the main task of the workers, indigenous and peasant organizations is to keep themselves prepared and organize it to the struggles to come. It's possible that we have a victory, electoral victory by the MAS, the party of Evo Morales, by his candidate, Luis Arce Catacora, who is the presidential candidate. He's a former economic minister from Evo Morales' government. But the point is that the right-wing and the extreme right-wing are preparing to have not really have a free election. So the main task for workers is to be organized and prepare themselves for the struggles to come. So the fight against the coup maneuvers that are still possible. So the idea of a coup inside the coup is still a possibility in Bolivia at this time. So the struggle against a future right-wing government that may emerge from fraudulent and irregular elections, it's a possibility. Or even the struggle in the context of a new mass government that will have to face an even other right-wing and country completely sunk into crisis. So in any way, the only way forward is to keep and mobilize the workers for the struggles that is coming. So the left and the social movements must be reorganized, and the lessons of the last defeats has to be learned, and to adopt a socialist program in the next struggles. It's vital at this moment. So that is the main point, I think.
Thank you so much, Andre. I think that really put to context that the whole fight for the elections, and I think it also sets us off nicely for another part of the world, Lebanon. So I think the Middle East generally was tumultuous this decade, and I think Lebanon specifically should be mentioned here. So earlier this month we had an explosion in Beirut port that cost the lives of 90 people at least, and injured at least 6,500 people. So that we all know that the explosion was caused by ammonium nitrate that was stored in the port since 2014, even though the danger was well known, and even officials in Lebanon tested the area just 6 months ago and said that it might cause like the entirety of Beirut to blow up. So everyone knew about this, nothing was done, and I think it's not surprising at all that this anger and the grief over this horrible tragedy is kind of translated into an anti-establishment sentiment, and it's also not started there. It connects to the social and environmental scandals in the country in the past years. We've seen Beirut blackout, we've seen no water, we've seen long periods of no refuse collection, and we've also seen recently, even before the explosion, mass movements there that we talked about a little bit in 2019. We've had over 1.5 million people on the streets in Lebanon to press the government, to demand to change the government system that's based on sectarian division. And the trigger was the ridiculous WhatsApp tax, but it's not just that. We've seen Lebanon suffering from intense corruption, from collapsing infrastructure, mass unemployment, rising national deficit, and obviously severe economic inequality, one of the worst in the world. And that's without even starting to talk about the sectarianism. So I think the anger at the system has been apparent for a really, really long time, especially since the Arab Spring. But in the events of the past year, we've seen that rage kind of elevate to new levels. And I was wondering if, JJ, can you tell us a little bit about the character of the Lebanese state so that we can understand better the reason for all these protests, but also kind of how the nature of these protests work within the structure of the system there?
Yeah, I mean, there was a Lebanese MP in the 1960s who once said, Lebanon is not a state, it is an international playground. And I think that sums up, in a sense, the first part of the answer to your question, Yara, in the sense that Lebanon has always been a terrain of intense imperialist meddling, foreign powers, rivalry, outside interventions, either directly or through proxies. And of course, the nature of the Lebanese state has been profoundly affected by that dynamic, because every of these outside capitalist powers has developed their own favored entry point, if you like, and local political allies through which they are trying to influence the country's affairs in accordance to their own interest. So the Iranian regime through Hezbollah, the Saudi regime through the Futures movement, etc., etc. But I think it's, in a sense, it's worthwhile to go back a little bit in time, because in 2 days, actually, it will be the centenary of the birth of the Lebanese state. But it wasn't really a natural birth. The Lebanese state was artificially put together by the colonial powers when they divided up the region between themselves after the First World War. But this was done in a way to facilitate imperialist control, with the French colonizers using religious divisions to assert their power. In a classic divide and rule manner, they gave ascendancy initially to a Maronite Christian elite at the expense of the Muslim majority. And that brings into play the second part of the answer to your question, which is the central role of sectarianism in the Lebanese states, which has been a part, in a sense, of its DNA from the very beginning. So today, when we say that Lebanon's political system is based on sectarian lines, what does it mean? I mean, it means that you have a confessional distribution of power, with the top positions occupied by the three most influential religions, and then a number of seats in parliament divided between 18 different religious sects. And that sectarian system, which was originally set up by the French colonial mandate, was subsequently cemented at the end of the Civil War through the Taif agreements in 1989, which was essentially an arrangement between ex-sectarian warlords to share power between themselves. However, the end of the Civil War coincided with the beginning of another war, which was an intensified class war against the workers and the poor. And sectarianism actually was instrumental to that end, in order to break and divide the power of organized labor, to develop a system of patronage networks based on sectarian allegiances, and erode the very concept of class solidarity, and in that way facilitate the capitalist elite's exploitation and impoverishment of the working class and its looting of the country's wealth. And this has come along with a process of sectarian co-optation and factionalization of the traditional trade union organization in the country. And I think, in a sense, it's very important to understand this sort of organic connection between sectarianism and capitalism, because sectarianism is not an end in itself for the ruling class. It has been the political conduit for a large profit-making enterprise for those who control the levers of the economy, who are by and large, as I explained before, the same people as those who control the state. But one of the historical significance of the revolt we have seen since last year in Lebanon, but also in Iraq, is the emergence of a powerful anti-sectarian mood, particularly strong among new generations of young people who have had enough of this divisive poison, and are explicitly rejecting this in the two countries where it has been the most clearly institutionalized as a political system of rule. And through this, consciously for some, unconsciously for others, they are kind of disclosing the naked class reality that lay behind this system. As Lebanese protesters say in one of their slogans, "Hunger has no religion." I mean, it's a basic but very effective slogan, because it expresses this idea that all the poor and exploited have the same interest and should come together to struggle against those who are starving us and dividing us along religious lines.
Thank you, JJ. I think this is a really interesting question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, actually. So I think like you said, there's a history of sectarianism and like divide and rule tactics that the international elite, but also the Lebanese elite, have used in Lebanon and worldwide in any kind of colony or ex-colony. And I think that, like you said, the lack of kind of like sectarian symbols and the kind of like actively oppose sectarianism in these protests is really, really striking and really visible. And I think that there were also a lot of protesters that, when they're asked, they were specifically saying that, the government and the elite have been trying to divide us, but we all have the same interests. And I think that's something that's really conscious. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about whether you think that unity beyond sectarian lines is necessary in struggles like this. Like, can there be a struggle to topple the government in Lebanon without unity beyond sectarian lines?
No, I think it's it's not only necessary; it's absolutely vital. And actually, as you describe, a key component of the Lebanese, the October Revolution, as they have called it, is that it was not only cross-sectarian in the sense of uniting all people from all religious backgrounds and communities, but it was explicitly anti-sectarian. I mean, one of the slogans chanted by the masses last year in the northern city of Tripoli was, "We are the popular revolution, you are the civil war." And that was a direct reference to the fact that all sections of the current ruling elite derive their position from the leading role in the country's brutal civil war, or are the offspring of such figures and are really sectarian dynasties in that sense. Now, one issue though I would raise, a caveat in a sense, is that it's important also to be aware of the fact that the danger of renewed sectarian polarization in the country is real. In the case the movement doesn't develop further and doesn't impose its own solution, particularly considering the level of economic desperation that exists in the country right now, on which sectarian forces feed themselves, that is a real danger. I mean, on Thursday, for example, this week, 2 people, including a child, died 5 kilometers south of Beirut in sectarian clashes between Hezbollah supporters and pro-Hariri Sunni local group. So, the mass movement has pushed sectarianism on the back foot. That is true. It has shown what is possible to overcome sectarian divisions, but it has not yet, wrested control from those bourgeois sectarian forces either. And that's the next step.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, JJ. I think that really is an interesting explanation of what's happening in Lebanon and also the steps forward for it as well. I want to kind of go into maybe a summary of what we talked about generally today. And I was obviously all these struggles are happening all around the world. And I think what we always stand for as internationalists is that all of these struggles are connected. They're all connected to one system and they can all learn from one another. So I was wondering, Andre, can you tell me a little bit about what you think that these struggles can actually learn from one another and how we can connect them even further?
Well, I think that all these struggles has the same basis, has the same origin in reality. So I think that the first fundamental lesson is that many struggles, we need to be prepared, because many struggles will take place in the context of a deep crisis to come, and we need to prepare for this in advance. So we have seen the impact of the movement in the US, for example, the Black Lives Matter, and the general mass movement in the US, and the impact of this on many other countries and how it has stimulated the struggles across the planet. So now we need to do this in a coordinated way. And I think you are right that the need for international coordination of the struggles, the worker struggles, the masses struggles, and the struggle for socialism, this is the basis for our organization, the International Socialist Alternative, is the meaning of the existence of our organization. So I think that another fundamental lesson is that one cannot trust the failed institutions of the bourgeois political system. So it is necessary to build movements from below and to wrest conquest from the struggle until we get enough strength to confront the political and economic system of capitalism. So in these struggles, the role of the working class is central, since it is only one that has the strength and the possibility of taking the struggle to its end, and also to the questioning of the capitalist basis of society. But we need to understand also that this working class is also made up of women, Black people, LGBT, indigenous people, and other sectors that, besides being exploited as workers, are oppressed by their specific conditions. So the struggle against these oppressions is fundamental, and is a fundamental part of our class struggle. So in these struggles, the demands for democratic rights are very important in a context of increasing authoritarianism. They have a very important weight, and the socialists must wield these banners with force. So at the same time, it is necessary to link these demands with the demands of a social and economic nature, which increasingly clash with the economic system, taking on an anti-capitalist character. So we need to link these democratic demands with the social and economic demands for the working class in an anti-capitalist direction. So we must therefore build a socialist strategy, program, and organization capable to win in the next period. I think that this is the main points for the next period.
Brilliant, thank you, Andre. And I wanted to also ask JJ, do you think that those struggles are connected, and what do you think are the lessons that they can learn from one another, as well as the struggles that haven't started yet and are going to start in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would emphasize, and probably the most obvious, is that these struggles highlight the need for an international response from the working class against the rotten system, which is in crisis everywhere. I mean, even just at the scale of the Middle East, it's not only in Lebanon that people are thirsty for radical change. Just in the last few weeks, we have seen an escalation of protest and strike in Iran, a protest breaking out again in the south of Iraq. And even in Israel, many workers and poor have had enough of Netanyahu's regime and are coming in the streets. So the need to build cross-border solidarity with the masses in struggle across the region and internationally is obviously a vital political implication of what is developing. I mean, in the last period, and even more so since the explosion in Beirut, we have seen a growing emigration of people out of Lebanon, at least for those who afford it. But the reality is that capitalism is everywhere and is in crisis everywhere. Now, when you look at the struggles in Bolivia, Lebanon, Belarus, I think there are important parallels. There are also important differences. What we should have no doubt about is that the masses are looking at each other's struggles and learning from them as well. Even if you look between the first wave of revolution in Middle East and North Africa 10 years ago, and the second wave started last year in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, etc., you can see how the masses have drawn important lessons. The involvement of women, for example, in the struggle has taken a more active, more conscious, more frontline role everywhere, and the demands have taken more space in this process as well. But also the whole illusion that if you eliminate the main head of state, the dictator figurehead, things are going to get better from there on. That was an idea that was still quite strong in the revolutionary movements of 2011 in Egypt and Tunisia. But in Lebanon, one of the main slogans had been, all of them means all of them. So that in that sense, there is a deeper understanding that it's the entire ruling class, the entire system that needs to be uprooted. Of course, knowing what you are up against is crucial, but the movement will also need to develop and articulate a clearer idea of what it is fighting for. And in the view of the ISA, this should be a democratic socialist economy and a socialist world. Now, another interesting aspect of this question is how some methods of actions are being replicated and tested in different parts of the world, drawing inspiration from each other as well. So if you compare Lebanon and Bolivia, for example, I think one striking similarity in the methods of struggle is a central role of street blockades to paralyze the country, which have been used extensively in both places. But as I said, there are also important differences, of course, as well. So an evident one is at the trade union level. Bolivia is a country which has still, I think, powerful trade union organizations and traditions, while in Lebanon, they've been largely diminished by years of corruption and sectarian infiltration. So from that point of view, Lebanon is probably closer to Belarus, actually, where official trade unions have become hopeless and where some attempt at building independent trade unions have taken place in the last period, even though they are still very, very weak. Now, a point of similarity in every of these movements, which represent a certain advantage for the ruling class, is that these revolutionary struggles are, in a sense, orphan of political organizations to convey their interest and offer a clear strategy forward. And in that sense, the danger for the working class to be sandwiched in the competition between various wings of the capitalist class, trying to reassert control, is a real danger. And I think that highlights the urgent need everywhere to build a clear political alternative, which is unapologetically fighting to overthrow the capitalist system. And I think those who are interested in doing so should definitely join the ISA to build that alternative with us.
Thanks so much. And yes, join the International Socialist Alternative. And if you're not quite sure yet, check out our website and you can read articles about all the topics we discussed today, what we're calling for as socialists, our program, and our analysis. So I want to end with our shout out of the week. And we are shouting out the Belgian section of the International Socialist Alternative and their actions against a police murder. So over the past few weeks, more details have come out of this racist, brutal murder of a man named Joseph Chavanek, maybe a Slovakian national, at the hands of the Belgian police. It's terrible. A video footage came out and it showed just how brutally this man was murdered after having been arrested at an airport. But despite being in obvious mental distress, the police officers covered him with a blanket and held him down for 15 minutes. And it provoked heart failure for him. And all the while, the police officers are laughing and making jokes. And even one of them disgustingly performs a Hitler salute. And so Joseph's widow made the video public, and she revealed the whole racist and brutal system behind this over 2-year-long cover-up. And so the federal police leadership and even the former Minister of the Interior Affairs are now aware of the circumstances surrounding this man's death, and they didn't lift a single finger. Not a single cop was ever charged and for any wrongdoing or even suspended. So despite the limitations of the pandemic and concerns, activists from Campaign Solidarity, which fights against racism in Belgium, was founded at the beginning of the summer by the Belgian section of the International Socialist Alternative Action. And so protests took place in 3 cities across the country against systematic racism and police brutality, putting forward the demands of a real independent investigation, democratic oversight over the police, and also an investment in public sector services and not repression. And so these demands we're seeing across the globe, which just shows the need of international organization and solidarity among the working class. I want to thank our speakers and my co-host Yaara today for a great show. Tune in next week where we're going to talk about the situation in the US, with the shooting of a man in Wisconsin and also the upcoming presidential elections. So see you same time, same place.